Blood for the Blood God, Skulls for the Skull Throne. Let's talk through some of the biggest datasheet changes to the World Eaters, including an absolutely destructive and dangerous Helbrute, a Demon Prince that can give your Berzerkers a 4+ invul save really easily, and the fact that it seems that about half your army is going to be able to scout move now, a lot of 8-bounds moving towards the fray. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk World Eaters and focus on a few of the biggest datasheet changes out of the new index. I'll certainly be aiming to get a full index review done in time, but in the meantime here are just a few of the most interesting changes out of the book to the way that the units are actually going to be played. I still feel like the theme of the army maybe isn't going to change too much. Generally rush at your opponents and cut them to bits with great big axes. I feel like a fair few of their 9th edition rules maybe had the units operate kind of similar, though 10th edition has some interesting options just for giving each unit its own individual special rule, maybe just to give them a little bit more flavour and difference to each other. Kind of thing similar to the Khorne Berzerker's Blood Surge in 9th edition. That one's still there, but I thought we'd talk through a bunch of the other ones and a few of the biggest changes to how the units operate, particularly things that make them either more dangerous in combat or get them there faster or safer. First up, just out of the enhancements table, one of the ones that I thought looked particularly fun was the Berzerker Glaive. I think that something that makes combat damage even more dangerous is always going to be interesting to World Eaters, and it looks like there's no restrictions on putting this on anything now, so you can give it to a great big Demon Prince with an enormous axe. This one's just a nice increase to attacks and damage. Demon Princes have a base profile of 6 attacks, strength 10, AP -2 and damage 3, really quite generalist with the Khorne strength buff, so that would be having them go up to a big 7 attacks and damage 4. It gets even more lethal when you're on the charge as well, as I guess you often will be. As with World Eaters, your opponents may be a little bit less likely to want to charge you. Instead of getting the +1 strength and damage, instead you get plus D3, so with an average roll of 2 you can expect somewhere around 8 attacks, strength 10, AP2 and a crazy damage 5 on your Demon Prince, and you could luck out with damage 6. Pretty hilarious that you could be ending the life of most battle tanks in literally just 2 unfailed saves with that thing, never mind the fact that you've got 8 attacks. You'd also get the benefit of the faction rule as well, +1 attack and +1 strength on the charge, so I guess if he is charging as well, that'll be up to 9 attacks and strength 11, definitely going to be hilariously dangerous, and there's not much in the game that's going to be laughing that off. You can get more stuff out of the Blessings of Khorne as well with those dice rolls, though often I think it might make more sense to give yourself more chance of making those charges with extra moves and advances and things. Both of the Demon Princes do also have ways to make their damage yet more lethal. The foot one might be able to get devastating wounds, and the winged one looks kind of fun as well with a fun but risky pre-game rule. You need to nominate one target that he is going to slay for the glory of Khorne. With all of this mighty attack profile, he'll be getting reroll hits and wounds against it, though it does mean that if the target doesn't die and he's still alive at the game's end, then the Demon Prince perishes. That does feel all very fun and fluffy. I guess you can't afford to tick off Khorne if he's going to give you all that massive damage buff. Realistically, probably not the biggest issue in the world. I feel like the Demon Prince is going to be playing super aggressive, and it might not matter besides for certain endgame objectives, for slaying certain units perhaps. By the end of the battle, his work is done anyway, mostly. In any case, certainly looks like World Eaters can have builds that just hit phenomenally hard in melee. Would be kind of terrifying to have this guy on the table alongside Angron. The World Eater's Master of Executions I thought was already at least fairly efficient, but now he's an interesting choice for Berzerkers as he gives them Fights First. Fights First was kind of underwhelming in 9th edition, though it's big in 10th. Basically it means that if your opponent charges you, you'll be able to select the unit first before they get to select their charging units, unless you happen to have multiple copies of it across the board or something. It means that if you did want to have a Master of Executions in your unit, you would get his fairly decent generalist damage output as well, strength 7 and damage 2 going up to strength 8 on the charge, and he also has the ability to snipe characters and get rerolls against them. It is just a pretty big deal for charge protection though. If your opponent's a mainly melee army and their only option for killing your Berzerkers is to charge them in combat, then he does have the potential to make them kind of unchargeable for certain lighter units unless they're just going to get killed first. I guess Khan the Betrayer would be the other main option for foot leaders for the faction. His buff is a bit more of a direct damage one. His unit gets reroll ones to hit and wound whenever they attack. Generally equates to around about a 36% damage increase that one, so pretty powerful. He's got his own solid melee, and he will fight in death if he's slain, and at least his tendency to kill a Berzerker every so often is a little bit reduced. He now only slays a Berzerker if he's not in combat in the fight phase, and also you have to fail a leadership test, so at least it's not happening just about every turn automatically or anything. Hopefully it winds up being a bit cheaper. I have a feeling that Games Workshop might still overvalue those rules slightly, as it's often just going to be more tempting to take more Berzerkers rather than one squad that's led by Khan. For delivering units to combat, I think it's certainly worth mentioning the Land Raiders' new shiny assault ramp, the same as the Loyalists and the standard Chaos Marines get, but perhaps more relevant for World Eaters than just about anyone else. The Land Raider assault ramp is the rule that means that your Land Raider can move 10 inches, your squad can get out 3 inches out the front of it, and then they're still allowed to make a charge, despite that normally being prevented by the transport rules. This one's an absolutely massive deal for World Eaters, whose perhaps main issue is trying to get their units into combat safely. In theory, that's an average 20-inch charge threat range for your standard troops, perhaps particularly nice for things like Berzerkers and Terminators, who move a bit slower than the Eightbound, who might be able to move in advance from cover to cover. You could even get the plus 2 inches to that movement distance with one of the Blood Blessings, though I guess the advance and charge wouldn't be quite as relevant, as you wouldn't be able to get the unit out after advancing. Still going to depend on the points cost, of course, but it might not be the worst to have a pretty much guaranteed delivery option, and one that's very tough at that, plus some actually quality anti-tank range fire, even if it does have to throw itself up into your opponent's face. One thing that I did find kind of fun throughout the datasheets was that, as well as Relentless Rage, the faction ability that gives you +1 attack and +1 strength on the charge, that's the one that you get from the World Eater's launch detachment, and it's basically the equivalent of their current Legion tactics. Above and beyond that, though, it still seems that just about all the units still feel the mark of Khorne, and that does still seem to be keeping separate from this detachment rule. Looks like, at least if you compare the datasheets to standard Codex Chaos Space Marines, a lot of them have increased strength. Say for example the World Eater's Terminator squad here, that has strength 6 on its accursed weapons, whereas the regular Chaos Space Marine datasheet has strength 5. Maybe not the biggest change in the world, but kind of nice to see that World Eaters are still going to be hitting extra hard just on their datasheet, even if they do get detachments later down the line where they don't have Relentless Rage. Other examples of that are the Chaos Spawn hitting on strength 6, so I guess going up to strength 7 and an extra attack if they're on the charge. Regular Chaos Space Marine ones are just strength 5, so are a lot more weedy. And compared with the Chaos Space Marine Demon Prince, it looks like he has the Khorne upgrade kind of built into him, so not getting any of the extra movement or toughness that Nurgle or Slanesh brings, but he does have the +2 strength built in. That's why he's strength 10. I feel like strength 10 Power Fist on the Terminator squad are kind of relevant as well. That's actually getting into the bracket where you're going to be wounding a lot of tougher vehicles on a 4+. Most Power Fists in the game will be wounding vehicles on a 5, given that they're only strength 8, and the vast majority of light tanks tend to start at toughness 9. I think the extra pip of strength alongside Relentless Rage will definitely help out in this era of a stretched toughness table, with a lot more units having a bit more of it. Next up, and perhaps one of the most standout things in the index, is the massive scout move potential that you have. In the previous codex in 9th edition, the usual play would often be to have Lord Invocatus lead the army, and then have him and 2 massive units of 8-bound scouting up towards the enemy. It just meant that with the very decent movement that the 8-bound have, and the pre-game move, you could be fairly reliable at getting decent first-turn charges out of them, and that's never a good start for your opponent's game plan. Have them fighting for their life in your own deployment zone against some of the nastiest combat troops in the galaxy. It still appears that Lord Invocatus has Scout himself, though it has dropped down to 6 inches, so it will be going a little bit slower this time round, but he still grants it to 2 World Eaters infantry units, so you can still have 8-bound or Exalted 8-bound moving into the midfield. The biggest change, though, is that regular 8-bound units won't need this rule, as they just have Scout innately now. Again, just 6 inches, not a bigger distance than that, but that's still going to be enough to get them into the midfield and potentially be threatening first-turn charges. Means that you could potentially scout with 3 units of 8-bound, maybe 2 units of Exalted 8-bound, and Lord Invocatus if you want to go absolute maximal rush, or you could just choose to take the 8-bound units along and ditch Lord Invo if you didn't want to have him leading your army. I do quite like the way, though, that he's not going to be fighting with Angron anymore. At least now you can still have the scout move ability and include Angron in the army list. It was certainly kind of annoying in the previous codex, where if you wanted Lord Invocatus' scout move, you had to give up on Angron, as he had to be your warlord. Then once you do have a whole bunch of scary World Eaters in the midfield, I guess then you could try and trigger the movement buffs turn 1, get a +2 inches to your movement, which you can get basically automatically out of the Blood Tithe. That's be 11-inch move for the 8-bound, so that's 17 inches forward after the scouts, I guess. And then first turn you could try and fish for that advance and charge, a little bit less likely over the blessings table, but I suppose it would be a bit more reliable if you had the Gorn Berzerker rerolls for objectives. Either way, though, it certainly feels like it's enormous first turn charge potential, particularly on certain deployment zones like the one where you just don't deploy within 9 inches of the centre. Another change I found really quite interesting was to the Demon Prince on foot. This guy seems to have changed quite a bit, both for standard Chaos Space Marines and for World Eaters and Thousand Sons. Seems now it's a bit more of a direct mighty monster in the middle of your force, something your opponent can try and shoot down with heavy anti-tank weapons, which is a disadvantage. But the theme of the Chaos Space Marine and Chaos Demons one seems to be to give out durability buffs, and the World Eaters seem to have that too. His special rule is called Infernal Fortitude, and this gives your foot troops a 4+ invul save when their units within 6 inches of his aura. I guess that is somewhat relevant on Eightbound. They'd have their 5+ invul save go down to a 4, but it just seems extra nice if you're fielding, say, mass foot Berzerkers or maybe Jackals on foot. Both of those are just going to be enormously tanky if you can have a 4+ invul save on them. Plus, depending on what your army is doing, you could choose the Feel No Pain type upgrade from the Blessings. Between those durability buffs, you could have a horde in the open that your opponent might really struggle to remove. I guess there is the weakness they could just directly target the Prince. It does seem at least kind of likely if they've got a whole load of heavy anti-tank guns that don't have other things to point at, and on this one the durability boost doesn't really do much for him. He's already got a 4+ invul save anyway. It's not super easy to take down though, with toughness 10, a 2+ save, and 10 wounds. Hopefully his points cost will be somewhat amenable that he can actually tank some damage and not feel too bad about doing so. I think one of the single most powerful datasheet changes though is the one to Helbrutes, who seem to have just a surprisingly unrestricted and dangerous frenzy rule, which means that every single time your opponent thinks about actually doing damage to this thing, they really should probably think twice. The rule is that each time an enemy unit targets this model, after the unit has finished making its attacks, this model can either shoot as if it were your shooting phase, or fight as if it were your fight phase. This is honestly surprisingly unrestricted. You basically get entire phases worth of damage basically for free every single time your opponent lobs an anti-tank gun at it, and it could just make Helbrutes an enormous challenge to deal with for the right armies. Basically, unless your opponent has got some sort of enormous anti-tank beast that can just body the Helbrute in one round of shooting. That's not enormously easy as well, with a toughness of 9, 8 wounds and a 2+ save. It's usually going to be getting at least a reasonable save like a 5+ or something, even against anti-tank weapons. What's perhaps even more surprisingly powerful is that he doesn't have to target the unit that attacked it. It means that the opponent could try and shoot him down with an anti-tank weapon, and then he could just fire off your autocannons or plasma cannon or something, and try and deal with another enemy unit that's yet to deal damage, either to shoot or charge. There's also no limit on how many times he could do this in one phase as well. If your opponent is just repeatedly taking pot shots at him with their tanks, he could potentially get something like 5 rounds of shooting out of the Helbrute if you keep on rolling well for his saves. I feel like between all that, the Helbrute is just enormously dangerous and hard to deal with, and it means that your opponent might actually just be incentivized just to try and ignore it all game long, which also might be a bit counterproductive really. If you can guarantee that the Helbrute's just stomping around and gets to act each turn just happily enough by itself, it should be able to get a good few turns of damage in before your opponent might start focusing it later in the game when more optimal targets are dead. Does seem just ludicrously scary though, if your opponent mainly has their anti-tank on small units having to take pot shots with single anti-tank weapons, then the Helbrute is just going to mow a bunch of them down in return. Overall, I think there's some pretty cool changes for the World Eaters here. Kind of nice to see a few of the units that were played a bit less get some interesting battlefield rules. I feel like a fighty winged Demon Prince seems quite fun to play with. The assault ramp and the scout move seem very nice for delivering World Eaters for big early game alpha strikes, and that Helbrute return fire type special rule looks absolutely terrifying. If you don't have some sort of enormous focused anti-tank unit that can delete it in one turn, your army might be taking a surprising amount of annoying punishment from heavy weapons. Look forward to hearing your thoughts though. What are you most excited about for World Eaters in 10th? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.